Have you ever thought what you would do if everything you knew were pain and suffering? One day I came across old documents that led me to a story that remained hidden for centuries. That name, Samuel, appeared in the shadows of the records of a plantation in Georgia. What I discovered made me out without air. The story I'm going to tell today is not in the school books. It does not appear in the official celebrations. Samuel created such a terrifying method that the slave lords trembled when he heard his whispered name. This is not just a story of revenge. It is the testimony of how human cruelty can be answered with equal coin. I am here to reveal details that were never counted, elements I found in forgotten files, deleted letters of the story. If you want to know the other side of American history, the one that many prefer to forget, follow this video until the end. You will never look at the history of slavery in the same way. Therefore, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any of these stories that challenge the official narrative. I keep thinking, how far can a human being bear before turning his pain into poison? The remains of the Riverstone plantation still exist, hidden among the tall pines of rural Georgia. The wind that passes through the ruins of the big house seems to whisper old secrets. They say that on New Year's nights the air there has a sweet and metallic smell. Strange, no? This land keeps the story of Samuel, the man who turned knowledge into a weapon, herbs in court, and a festive supper in the final court. Step carefully on these ruins. Under the earth you step, bodies have been buried in a hurry, their mouths contoured in expressions of agony, their eyes opened in terror. Here, in 1831, the line between victim and executioner fell as smoke in the air. In this place, a man decided that there was no difference between living and dying, just between dying in silence or taking with him those who tortured him. The story I am going to tell about how the slave system created its own destruction by teaching the oppressed that violence was the only language that oppressors understood. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The Riverstone plantation extended to 800 acres of Georgia red earth, bordering the Savannah River as a lazy serpent. From the top of the hill, the big house of the Thornwell dominated the landscape with its white columns and large balconies, from where the constant smoke of the cotton mill. The barracks of the enslaved were strategically positioned to be seen from the balconies, 50 small wood and clay buildings without windows, arranged in 5 accurate rows. There, 230 men, women, and children lived under the whip of the foreman, Wesley Thornwell, the eldest son of the patriarch. The day began with the bell at 4:30 a.m., even in the harsh winter of Georgia. Each enslaved had a cotton quota, 120 pounds a day for men, 90 for women. Failure to comply meant the trunk or the public whip. On summer nights, the air was heavy with the odor of sweat and blood. The children learned early not to cry, even when they saw their parents being punished. Many tried to escape. Few could. Those who were captured came back without a foot or a hand. To remind everyone of the price of freedom, said old Thornwell, while smoking his Cuban cigar on the porch of Casa Grande. That December 1830, an unusual cold punished the region. Fine ice covered the fields in the morning, and it was said to be the cruel winter of the century. No one imagined that it would not only be the climate that would bring death to Riverstone plantation. Samuel was not like the others. Born in 1798, the son of a domestic slave and unknown father, although the traces of old Thornwell revealed on his face, he grew up between two worlds. Since childhood, he demonstrated acute intelligence that has not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Thornwell, Elizabeth, decided to make him his personal project, teaching him to read and write in secret, not out of kindness, but for intellectual vanity. Samuel learned to serve at the table with the accuracy of a Swiss clock, to recognize the French wines for the aroma, to prepare home remedies for the headaches of the lady. He became the main butler of Casa Grande at 25. The others enslaved saw him with a mix of respect and distrust. They called him the Shadow Man, someone who existed in the corners, listening to everything, seeing everything, keeping everything in relentless memory. At night in the senzalas, it was Samuel who turned when they needed herbs to cure whip wounds or relieve toothache. He knew each plant in the region, knew the power of each root, each sheet. This knowledge came from his grandmother, brought from Dahomey, who before he died of exhaustion in the fields, he whispered in his ear ancient secrets about life and death, healing and destruction. Samuel moved with the fluidity of those who know all the paths and all doors. It was present in the Thornwell family conversations about politics, economics, about the growing fears of slave rebellions after the Nat Turner uprising. Each day, every insult swallowed, every order obeyed with a servile smile, something grew inside it, something cold and calculating, something patient. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth. If you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The year 1830 brought a climb of cruelties to the Riverstone plantation. In March, Wesley Thornwell decided that the slaves worked too lazy and increased their daily quotas by 30%. 15 elderly died in the next 2 weeks. In June, after an accidental fire in the cotton deposit, 3 men were accused of sabotage. Wesley ordered them to be tied to trees and left to die under the scorching sun. Samuel was forced to bring them water, just enough to prolong the suffering. July brought the visit of buyers from Alabama. 2 families were separated. A mother threw herself into the river with her baby to see her 6-year-old son being taken. In September, Elizabeth Thornwell discovered that one of the domestic slaves, Harriet, taught African songs to children. He told him to cut his tongue. Samuel held the basin with the blood. In October, old Thornwell announced the coming of his 10 heirs to New Year's supper, children, grandchildren, nephews. A celebration of family prosperity, he said, raising his cup in a toast at dinner. Samuel served the wine, his face a perfect mask of subservience. In November, a group of enslaved tried to escape during a storm. 6 were recaptured. Wesley invented a new punishment. The toes were cut one by one over 6 days. On the 6th day, their youngest, a 16-year-old, spat on Wesley's face. It was tied to 4 horses and quartered alive. Samuel watched everything from the kitchen porch, his eyes recording every detail, every scream, every splash of blood on the red earth of Georgia. On December 3, 1830, Samuel received the news that broke the last thread that linked him to humanity. His mother, Ruth, now 54 and working on the laundry of the plantation, was accused of stealing a silk handkerchief. There was no proof. It was not necessary. Old Thornwell ordered it to be publicly whipped, 50 whip. It was winter, and Ruth's fragile body didn't resist. Samuel was called to collect the body. When turning it, he saw old and new marks on his mother's body. He noticed the shape of hands in his arms, bitten on his shoulders. Then he understood what was happening on the nights when Wesley Thornwell inspected the laundry. That night, in a thin and cold rain, Samuel buried his mother in a corner away from the property, near the oldest oak in the region. There was no coffin. There was no ceremony. Only Samuel, his knees in the mud, his hands bleeding with a broken shovel. When finished, it didn't cry. Something had changed in his eyes. The human brightness had disappeared, replaced by cold and mathematical clarity. He took a piece of his mother's clothes, torn by the whip, and tied it on his wrist. "I promise, Mother," whispered in the darkness, "they will pay, all of them." Upon returning to his quarters in the bottom of the big house, his step was light, had made a decision. The clock of revenge had begun to tell. The Thornwell were not just a family, they were a cotton dynasty. The patriarch, 78-year-old George Thornwell, ruled with wrinkled but firm hands. His firstborn, Wesley, 52, was known for calculated sadism, a man who smiled while punishing. There was also Frederick, the second child, a trader from New Orleans who made a fortune selling smuggled slaves from the Caribbean. The daughters, Victoria, Elizabeth Jr., and Margaret, had married other farmers and traders, expanding the Thornwell Empire by Georgia and South Carolina. And there were the grandchildren, William, Charles, Thomas, and the young George II, educated in the best universities in the North, returning to manage family properties with modern methods in Europe. Each, in their own way, profited the blood and sweat of hundreds of enslaved. But the event that sealed the destination of the family took place on December 15, 1830. That day, Reverend Josiah Smith came to the plantation, bringing news of the growing abolitionist pressure in the North. During dinner, old Thornwell exploded in fury. "Before you free a single black man, I will set it up and kill them all," he shouted, hitting his fist on the table. Then, calmer, he announced his plan. He would sell half of the enslaved for plantations in the deep southern Mississippi and Louisiana, where the conditions were even more brutal. "We will hold the auctions after New Year's celebrations," he said. "And we'll start with the kitchen and laundry. These are the most dangerous, the ones who know how to read." Samuel stopped behind the patriarch's chair, served more wine. No one noticed the light tremor in his hands, nor the deadly shine in his eyes. That night, hidden in his room, Samuel scribbled names on a piece of paper. 10 names, 10 Thornwell, 10 targets. The humiliation arrived 3 days before Christmas. Old Thornwell gathered all the servants of the house in the main hall. "I have information that some of you have been taught to read," he said, his sharp voice like broken glass. "This ends today." One by one, house slaves were called ahead, forced to kneel, questioned. Those who hesitated received a string of cane on their backs. When it was Samuel's turn, he denied perfect composure. "No, master, I can't read." Wesley Thornwell laughed. "Let's see." They brought a book, open on a random page. "Read," he ordered. Samuel pretended to be confused, frowning to the paper. "I can't, master." Wesley smiled, pleased. Then, in a quick movement, he threw the book on the floor and stepped on him. "Now clean my shoes with your tongue." The hall silenced. Samuel felt the blood throbbing in his temples. For a moment, just a moment, his eyes met Wesley's, and something passed between them. Knowledge. Wesley saw, Samuel knew, but it was too late for Wesley. Samuel knelt slowly, feeling the rough fabric of the rug against his knees. He lowered his head and licked the dirt of the leather boot. The taste of earth, manure, and aged leather filled his mouth. Heard laughs. Wesley then stepped on his neck, pressing him against the floor. "This is your place, Samuel. Don't forget that." That night, alone, Samuel threw up until there is nothing in his stomach. Then he washed his mouth with an infusion of herbs. He sat in the darkness and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he had made his final decision. The plan that was elaborating for weeks now had a date. The new year would not just bring a new calendar, would bring a new world. In the dead of night, Samuel began to implement his plan. First, the accomplices, few but essential. He selected Esther, the 60-year-old cook who had lost 3 children to the Wesley whip, Isaac, the coachman who knew all the roads within 30 miles, Josiah, the blacksmith whose hands could double metal like straw, and the 17-year-old Clara, who worked on cleaning and could move around the house without being noticed. Each, Samuel trusted only one piece of the puzzle. No one except him knew the full plan. Then the mapping. Samuel drew from memory, in the candlelight, the full layout of the big house, marking the exits, the back stairs, the rooms where each Thornwell would sleep on the night of the celebration. He studied the habits of each family member. Who drank the most, who was the first to get up, who remained late. The resources came from their own house. Herbs harvested in the forest, empty glasses of the pharmacy, kitchen ingredients. The chosen date had meaning. December 31st, New Year's Eve, when the family would be gathered to celebrate their prosperity, built on black bodies. Samuel appointed his plan the Last Dinner, a reference to Christian knowledge that Elizabeth Thornwell was so proud to have taught him. In the 10 days before the event, Samuel went down 6 times to the oak where his mother was buried. On the last visit, he whispered to Earth, "Just 2 days left, Mother. 2 days, and starts harvesting." On New Year's Eve, 2 parallel worlds coexisted in the Riverstone plantation. In the big house, created ran from side to side, preparing the banquet. Silver chandeliers were polished until it shines like mirrors. Linen sheets were exchanged in all guest rooms. In the main hall, Savannah hired musicians tuned their instruments. The best English dishes and the French crystals were arranged on the long dining table, covered with lace towels. The 10 Thornwell have arrived throughout the day, in elegant carriages, bringing blasts full of gifts and clothes. Women displayed imported dresses of Paris. Men discussed politics and businesses among brandy bowls. Laughs echoed through the corridors. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the property, in the small room behind the kitchen, Samuel worked. His hands moved with surgical accuracy, mixing herbs, roots, and powders in exact proportions. The base was the datura, which grew wild in the swamps of the region, known by the enslaved as devil's trumpet. To her, Samuel added cicuta extract, belladonna extract, and an African root that his grandmother had taught him to recognize, brought clandestinely in slave ships. The mixture was divided into 10 small cloth bags, each with the exact amount for a cup of wine. Clara, with her light steps, brought him a map of the tables, designed to charcoal. Samuel studied him, memorizing each position. Esther prepared the cranberry sauce that would accompany the turkey, a special sauce made with red wine to highlight the taste. Josiah was discreetly forged locks to the back doors. Isaac checked the horses, selecting the 4 fastest. At noon, there was a crash fireworks, fired by order of old Thornwell to announce the beginning of the festivities. In Samuel's room, the sound was received with a thin smile. 3 knocking on the door, the combined signal. It was time. At 7 o'clock in the evening of December 31st, 1830, 10 members of the Thornwell family sat at the dining table. The room gleamed with the light of dozens of candles. In the center of the table, a huge roasted turkey, surrounded by dishes of potatoes, corn, green beans, and cornbread. French wine bottles, personally chosen by George Thornwell, were opened and served in crystal glasses. Samuel circulated around the room with precise, silent movements, filling the chalices. For each of the 10 Thornwell, a special mixture fell from the ring that wore at the minimum finger, a ring with a secret compartment. No one noticed. They were too busy with their laughs, their stories, their celebration of wealth built with blood. Old Thornwell rose to a toast. To our family, to our legacy, to our superiority. Everyone drank. Samuel retreated to the shadows, telling silently. 10 minutes later, Frederick Thornwell took his hand to his throat. "It's hot here, isn't it?" he asked, loosening his collar. 20 minutes later, Victoria dropped her fork. His pupils had dilated so much that his eyes looked completely black. 30 minutes after the toast, young George II began to scream, pointing to something invisible on the ceiling. 40 minutes, and Elizabeth Jr. fell from his chair, convulsing. Wesley was the first to understand. He tried to get up, staggered. The Vigno, bullied, the numbing tongue. A someone? Poisoned. His eyes found Samuel's, standing by the door. For the first time in his entire life, Samuel allowed his true face to reveal himself. Smiled. "This is by Ruth," he said, his voice clear and firm. Old George Thornwell, with 78 years of cruelty in his back, was the last to succumb. He dragged on the table, overthrowing dishes and cups. You will burn in hell," he managed to say. Samuel approached slowly. He leaned over the man who had enslaved his mother, his father, his ancestors. "I'm already in hell, master. You who are starting." One by one, the 10 Thornwell died at the dining table. Some in agony, some in delirium, some begging for water, others for mercy. Samuel observed every death with the same attention he had watched the punishments they inflicted. When the last heart stopped, a deep silence took over the room. The wall clock marked 8:47 a.m. The year 1830 was not over, but one era had come to an end. After the death of the Thornwell, Samuel organized the exodus. In absolute silence, the enslaved were gathered in the central courtyard. Young children were carried, elderly supported by young people. Samuel appeared on the porch of the big house, still wearing his butler uniform. "Tonight," he said, his low but audible voice in the stillness of the night, "we were born again." He explained what he had done. He did not ask for forgiveness or glory. I just said, anyone who wants to leave should leave now. The horses are ready, the separate provisions. Isaac knows the way to the north. It distributed the essentials for escape: knives, blankets, dry food. The keys of the handcuffs were delivered. Chains fell to the ground with metallic noises. Josiah, the blacksmith, brought the weapons he had hidden over the years: old musks, machetes, a pistol. Before they departed, Samuel led a ritual. Under the starry sky of Georgia, he lit a large fire in the center of the courtyard. One by one, objects were thrown into the flames: Wesley's whip, the book of plantation records, Samuel's butler's clothes. When the fire reached its peak, the 230 men, women, and children formed a circle and, for the first time in many years, openly sang songs from their ancestral land. The voices raised on New Year's Eve, a chorus of lament and hope. At 11 a.m., the first column of liberated left north, led by Isaac. An hour later, the second group went west, where Maroons' communities lived hidden in the swamps. The last group, especially the elderly and children, took the way to the south, towards the Florida Seminoles, which welcomed runaway slaves. Samuel was the last one from. Before leaving the plantation, he returned to the big house. In Salt, the dinner, the 10 bodies remained in their chairs, like a macabre banquet painting. On the wall above the fireplace, Samuel hung a piece of his mother's torn clothes. Then, with a chandelier, it burned down the curtains. When he left, the first flames already devoured the house that had been his arrest for so long. What became known as the Riverstone method spread throughout the South as fire in dry straw. In the following weeks, reports of domestic slaves poisoned their masters appeared in South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana. Panic took over the Southern aristocracy. The newspaper of Augusta published on January 17, 1831, "An epidemic of mysterious deaths plagues Southern plantations. Doctors speculate about a new form of fever, while authorities investigate the terrifying possibility of a conspiracy among blacks." The governor of Georgia sent an urgent letter to Washington. "I request immediate shipping of federal troops. There are reasons to believe that we are facing an organized revolt, more dangerous than any armed uprise, because it occurs silently within our own homes." In February, an emergency meeting of slave owners in Charleston established new rules. Slaves could no longer prepare food or drinks for whites without supervision. Any slave suspected of knowing herbs or medicines should be sold immediately or executed. Botany books should be kept under key. In March, the War Secretary ordered searches in all senzalas for suspicious materials of plant or mineral nature. Hundreds of enslaved were whipped to death because they had simple medicinal herbs. But it was too late. The knowledge had spread, whispered from ear to ear in the plantations. In April, an anonymous leaflet circulated clandestinely among enslaved communities. "Justice has many forms. Some are fast like lightning, some slow like poison, but all are right, like dawn." Signed only, S. Samuel's hunt began immediately after the discovery of the bodies in the Riverstone plantation. 50 gunmen, led by the sheriff of Richmond County, scoured the forests and swamps of Georgia. Snack dogs followed his trail to the Savannah River, where the trail disappeared. On January 15, 1831, the governor offered a $5,000 reward for his capture, the largest amount ever offered by a runaway slave. Samuel's portrait circulated through the South, with the description, "Black and slender black, about 30 years, speaks well and has educated ways, extremely dangerous, sought by multiple murders." On February 3rd, a slave from a neighboring plantation was captured and tortured to reveal the whereabouts of Samuel. Under the extreme pain, he invented a story about Samuel hidden in a 20 miles. When the hunters arrived at the scene, they found only one message written with charcoal on the wall: "You drink from the same cup that served." On March 17th, a group of reward hunters intercepted a bunch of runaway slaves near the South Carolina border. Among them was Clara, the young woman who had helped Samuel. It was hanged in Augusta's public square as an example. On April 22nd, news from a black man educated preaching rebellion among slaves in Alabama. A militia was sent, but the man disappeared before they arrived. On May 30th, a fire destroyed 3 plantations in Louisiana. Witnesses spoke of a high man watching the flames at a distance. It was only on June 19, 1831, that Samuel was finally cornered. A betrayal of another fled, captured and tortured slave revealed his hiding place in an ancient quilombo in the depths of the swamps of Georgia. 200 men surrounded the place to dawn. The battle lasted hours. When they finally invaded the camp, they found Samuel alone, sitting calmly on a trunk as if waiting them. It offered no resistance. When they put him in chains, he smiled and said only, "The poison is already in your blood." Samuel was hanged in the central square of Augusta, Georgia, on July 4, 1831, a deliberately chosen date to reaffirm white supremacy on American Independence Day. It is estimated that 5,000 people attended to watch the execution. Enslaved were forced to witness the event brought from plantations within 30 miles. Reports of the time describe Samuel climbing to the event with the dignity of a king. They offered you a chance to confess their sins. Instead, he looked at the crowd and said aloud and clear, "Remember me when they drink your wine." His last words, seconds before the trapdoor opened under his feet, were, "I don't die today. I spread myself." The body was left hanging for 3 days as a warning. On the 4th day, when they went to remove it, they found that someone they had cut a lock of his hair at night, a powerful amulet in the African tradition. The body was burned and the ashes spread in the river to prevent its tomb from becoming a pilgrimage place. The authorities thought they would erase their memory. They were wrong. Samuel never disappeared. In the decades that followed, his name became a whisper, legend, in power. In the kitchens of the plantations, enslaved exchanged significant looks when they served wine to you. In the senzalas, mothers told their children stories about the man who turned knowledge in freedom. In the senzalas, mothers told their children stories about the man who turned knowledge in freedom. A song was born in the cotton fields, simple melody, apparently innocent lyrics about a river running red and 10 sleeping gentlemen, which the forefront have never understood, but that all enslaved recognized how Samuel's story. Objects associated with him acquired almost sacred status. A silver ring with secret compartment, supposedly the same as he had used that fateful night, ran from hand to hand among enslaved communities as a symbol of resistance. A small bottle of green glass, they said, contained the last drop of Samuel's original mixture, never open, but maintained as a reminder of what it was possible to do. Decades after his death in 1862 during the Civil War, Union soldiers found, carved in trees near abandoned plantations, a recurring symbol, a chalice with a star above, the brand of Samuel. After emancipation, former slaves took history to the west to the growing cities. In black communities of Atlanta, Charleston, and New Orleans, he counted about ghosts of 10 white gentlemen who wandered forever for water to calm the fire in their throats. The White Academy tried to erase Samuel from history, classifying the incident as unexplained tragedy or accident during celebration. Black historians, however, preserved the truth. In 1887, Frederick Douglass mentioned in a speech, "There were those who fought with weapons, there were those who fought with words, and there were those who, like Samuel de Rivestone, fought with their knowledge, but who conquered anyway." Today, Samuel's story lives in multiple dimensions. For some, it is the maximum symbol of slave resistance. Not Nat Turner's open rebellion, but calculated revenge, the appropriation of the oppressor's knowledge against himself. For others, a historical puzzle, with deliberately vacant official documents about what really happened that New Year's night. In universities, its morality, its significance, its historical authenticity is debated. But in communities that descend from those he freed, Samuel remains an almost mythological figure, not a saint, certainly not a villain, but a man who refused to be just a victim. In 2010, archaeologists found the ruins of the Riverstone plantation. Excavations revealed the dining room where the event took place, with the long table still in place, charred by the fire. In a corner of the property, under an old oak, they found the remains of a simple grave, probably from Ruth, Samuel's mother. Beside, a small buried glass bottle containing traces of damage, belladonna, and other unidentified herbs. The place is now preserved as a historic site, although the official plate mention only important pre-war crop. But every December 31st, flowers appear mysteriously next to the old oak. It is unknown who leaves them there. Samuel's history forces us to question the boundaries between justice and revenge, between resistance and cruelty. It reminds us that slavery has not only produced passive victims, but also silent warriors who used the weapons they had available. Its memory remains an underground river in American history, sometimes invisible on the surface but always running, always shaping the ground above. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Samuel's story touched her heart. Share so that Samuel's memory will never be forgotten. To fully understand the impact of what Samuel did, it is necessary to recognize the greatest historical context. The 1830s was a moment of growing tension in the slave South. The abolitionist movement gained strength in the North, while Southern states hardened their laws of slavery in response. The fear of insurrections was constant, fueled by the successful Haitian Revolution and revolts like Denmark Vesey and Charleston. The rebellion of Nat Turner would take place only 7 months after the events in Riverstone in August 1831, and some historians speculate about possible connections between the two events. Samuel's strategy represented a different form of resistance. While Nat Turner opted for open rebellion with direct and visible attacks, Samuel chose a more subtle and psychologically devastating approach. His tactic explored the greatest fear of the Southern aristocracy, that those who served their meals, who cared for their children, who lived within their homes, could silently turn against them. Poison, as a method, also carried a symbolic weight, was the perfect metaphor for how the institution of slavery itself poisoned the society that practiced it. Samuel's originality was to transform the knowledge imposed by Elizabeth Thornwell herself, reading, writing, refined service, in liberation instruments. He used Casa Grande's own privilege system, where domestic slaves received differentiated treatment from those of the countryside, to completely subvert it. This was a powerful message to other enslaved. The oppressor's tools could be reappropriated and redirected. The next 10 years to Samuel's death saw a brutal hardening of the laws that controlled the enslaved. The Black Code was revised throughout the southern region. The teaching of reading and writing was prohibited to slaves under severe penalties. Domestic slaves were constantly watched, and many gentlemen hired white tastings to prove their food before they consumed it. The incident caused a crisis of confidence in the slave system that was never completely resolved. Among the former slaves and their descendants, stories about Samuel were transmitted in the form of codes, in work songs, in the patchwork quilts, in patterns of braided hair. Their presence remained. The expression, "drinking of Samuel's chalice," emerged as a code for acts of secret resistance. During the Civil War, black spies who worked for the Union used rings with secret compartments, in honor of the one that Samuel had used. The ramifications of the case extended beyond the American borders. In Cuba and Brazil, still under slave regime, stories about Samuel's methods circulated among enslaved communities. Slave owners in these countries were so alarmed that they established specific prohibitions against the Georgian method, as it became known. Samuel's figure challenges the traditional narrative on slave resistance. He was not a reluctant martyr, not a charismatic leader gathering pasta for the battle. It was a solitary strategist using patient observation and deep knowledge to plan a single devastating blow. Its history reminds us that resistance assumes many forms, some of them unexpected and deeply disturbing even to modern patterns. In 1998, during the renewal of the Georgia History Museum in Atlanta, controversy emerged about Samuel's inclusion among the highlighted historical figures. Critics argued that celebrating a mass poisoner would be morally problematic, regardless of the context of slavery. Defenders countered that omitting their history would be to continue the erasure of forms of resistance that do not fit in comfortable narratives. After intense debates, a small panel was included, mentioning the incident without glorification or condemnation, simply as part of the complex tapestry of resistance to slavery. In contemporary popular culture, echoes from Samuel's history appear occasionally. The movie The White House Butler, 2013, contains a scene in which the protagonist as a child watches his mother to be raped by a white foreman, a formative experience similar to Samuel's. Ta-Nehisi Coates' novel, The Water Dancer, makes allusions to a slave with herbal knowledge that causes the death of his oppressors. In circles of modern activism, the expression "remember Samuel" occasionally appears in discussions about creative resistance against oppressive systems. For many contemporary historians, Samuel's case raises important questions about how we classify and understand slave resistance. Open uprisings like Nat Turner's are easily recognizable as resistance, but individual acts like Samuel's occupy a more ambiguous moral and historical space. They challenge the simplistic dichotomy between submission and rebellion, showing that there was a vast intermediate territory of sabotage, subversion, and everyday resistance. Samuel's story also highlights the role of traditional African knowledge as a form of resistance. The herbal techniques he used were a combination of African ancestral wisdom and knowledge acquired in the Americas, a living example that anthropologists call transcultation. This ethnobotanical knowledge was often underestimated in historical records, but represented a powerful cultural continuity and a form of power that escaped the control of enslavement. Archaeological excavations in ancient plantations revealed evidence of herbal practices between enslaved small vials buried under cabanas, carefully preserved non-native seeds, plant processing tools. These findings suggest that Samuel's case, although exceptional on its scale and impact, was part of a broader tradition of botanical knowledge as an agency and, occasionally, resistance. In the words of historian Vincent Brown, cases like Samuel's represent the necropolitics of enslaved, a policy of death developed by those who were perpetually exposed to violence and premature death. By controlling even momentarily who lived and who died, Samuel temporarily reverses the fundamental dynamics of slavery. His act was both a denial of the absolute power of the Lord and an affirmation of his own humanity, even through terrible means. Samuel's deepest legacy is perhaps in the fear that he instilled in the heart of the slave system, the disturbing realization that no level of surveillance, no brutality, could completely guarantee control over those who were enslaved. Poisoning was particularly terrifying because it could occur in full view, because it transformed the domestic and the familiar into dangerous and deadly. After Samuel, no slaves could be absolutely sure of his safety, even on his own dinner table. This is the final paradox of Samuel's story. Through a terrible act, he exposed the terrible truth in the heart of American slavery, which it was a system based on the constant fear of both masters and enslaved, a system that poisoned not only individual bodies, but all society that was supported in it. Somewhere in the swamps of Georgia, according to legend, there is an old tree where Samuel spent his last night in freedom. Those who spend the night under their branches will dream of 10 figures on a dinner table and with a high man watching silently from the shadows. A man who, through his terrible revenge, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, resistance, and the true cost of freedom. In modern days, researchers at the University of Emory and Howard University have worked to scientifically document the properties of herbs Samuel probably used. Ethnobotanical studies have revealed that the combination of datura, belladonna, and certain African roots could, in fact, produce the symptoms described in historical reports: hallucinations, paralysis, and eventual cardiac arrest. This work not only validates the technical possibility of Samuel's method, but also highlights the sophisticated pharmacological knowledge preserved by enslaved communities. Medicine historians have noticed an interesting change in Southern medical records after 1831. There is a significant increase in documented cases of suspicious poisoning, and doctors began publishing articles on how to identify plant poisons in food and beverage. Some plantations have hired resident doctors exclusively to monitor owners' health and test suspicious foods, a significant additional cost that demonstrates the economic impact of Samuel's inspired fear. In African American oral traditions, Samuel is sometimes portrayed as an almost supernatural figure, a caster, or man of power. These stories emphasize their connection with African spiritual knowledge, suggesting that he not only poisoned the Thornwell, but also cast a curse on the entire lineage. Such reinterpretation reflects the importance of African spiritual systems as sources of strength and resistance during slavery. The Rivestone plantation was never rebuilt after the fire. The lands were eventually divided and sold to small farmers, many of them ex-slaved after the Civil War. Ironically, the place where Casa Grande once existed in the 1880s became the site of one of the first schools for black children in rural Georgia, a transformation that would have pleased Samuel, which valued both knowledge and the way for freedom. In private writings discovered in the decades after his death, Frederick Douglass mentioned Samuel several times. In a letter of 1874, he wrote, "They often ask me if I condemn the methods of the one who is called the poisoner of Georgia. I always answer, who am I to judge? Are his humanity denied every moment of each day?" In Canada, among runaway slaves that escaped the Underground Railroad, there were annual rituals on December 31st. Small cups were filled with red wine and left untouched on the table during New Year's supper, a silent tribute to Samuel and a reminder of the price paid for the freedom of many. In the 1960s and 1970s, during the movement for civil rights and the emergence of Black Power, there was a renewed interest in Samuel's figure. More radical activists invoked it as an example of direct resistance against oppression. Poems, plays, and songs were created celebrating their action as a revolutionary act against a genocidal system. This political reassessment of its history continues to generate intense debates about the moral limits of resistance against deeply immoral systems. Samuel's case also influenced American literature in subtle forms. Toni Morrison, in his beloved novel, explores similar themes of retributive violence and the psychological cost of slavery. William Faulkner, in Absalom, Absalom, portrays the latent fear of retribution that permeated the families of slave owners. The idea that those who were brutalized would eventually return violence in some way became a recurring theme in the literature that examines the legacy of slavery. In 2018, an analysis of mitochondrial DNA carried out in slave descendants from the Riverstone region revealed genetic connections with specific populations of the present Benin, the former region of the Kingdom of Dahomey, exactly where Samuel's grandmother would have come, according to reports. This discovery provides physical support for the transmission of specific knowledge about plants between generations, crossing the Atlantic and surviving the trauma of slave trafficking. The resistance method chosen by Samuel, poisoning by a domestic servant, carries deep cultural meanings. In Western literature, from Hamlet to Agatha Christie tales, poisoning is often characterized as a female weapon or crime of servants, a form of violence available to those without access to direct physical power. In adopting this method, Samuel subverted not only racial hierarchies, but also conceptions of power, based power and social class. Psychologists and historians have noticed how Samuel's history challenges simplified narratives about trauma and victimization. It demonstrates the possibility of an agency even under extreme conditions of oppression, although this agency can assume morally complex forms. Your case invites us to consider how trauma survivors can mobilize their experiences not only for personal healing, but also for radical social transformation, sometimes through means that challenge conventional ethical norms. In contemporary culture, Samuel's figure resonates with debates on restorative justice versus retributive. His act embodies an extreme form of retributive justice, an eye for an eye, life for life. However, by facilitating the escape of hundreds of other enslaved, he also created possibilities for regeneration and a new beginning for an entire community. This tension between retribution and restoration remains central to discussions on how societies deal with massive historical injustices. In temples of Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Caribenhas religions, such as Candomblé, Santeria, and Vaudou, there are rituals that some practitioners connect Samuel. In these traditions, it is sometimes associated with Obaluaye or Babalu Aye, orishas related to disease and healing, or Pope Legba, the guardian of the paths and crossroads. These associations reflect how their history has transcended national borders to become part of a broader diasporic mythology of resistance. Some contemporary theorists propose that Samuel's history offers insights to understand modern forms of resistance between marginalized populations. The concept of weapons of the weak of political scientist James C. Scott, daily resistance tactics such as slow work, smaller sabotage, and false compliance, finds in Samuel an extreme example of how specific knowledge can become resistance when more direct methods are impossible. Among forensic doctors and toxicologists, Samuel's case occasionally appears as a historical study of mass poisoning. What makes your case particularly remarkable from the forensic point of view is the accuracy with which it apparently calibrated the doses, enough to kill, but not so fast that they prevent victims from understanding what was happening. This accuracy suggests a sophisticated pharmacological knowledge that challenges stereotypes about scientific knowledge available to enslaved people. Samuel's story remains relevant because he reminds us that resistance to oppression rarely follows in morally simple or comfortable. It challenges our tendency to sanitize resistance stories, to seek immaculate heroes and nonviolent methods. Historical reality is more complex. Sometimes those who resist brutal systems do so through means that reflect the very brutality of the system against which they fight. In the end, perhaps Samuel's most lasting legacy is the questioning he forces us to ask. In a fundamentally unfair system based on systematic violence and dehumanization, what forms of resistance are morally justifiable? It is a question without easy responses, but it continues to resonate through American history and beyond, whenever oppressed people seek ways for liberation.